I think of fear and values as those two opposing forces that are playing on you. One is pushing you forward to act with courage, and the other is pulling you back that there's bad news ahead.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Today I'm talking to Ashish Goel. Ashish is the author of Drawing on Courage, Risks Worth Taking and Stands Worth Making. It's a part of a series of guides being published by the Stanford D.school. Ashish is a designer, an entrepreneur, and a former teaching fellow at the Stanford D.school, where he has taught classes on design thinking, digital product design, and map making. Previously, he worked as head of design at Zomato, India's DoorDash and Yelp rolled into one, and today advises companies in the art and science of product design, and he's currently building Boca, a direct-to-consumer sparkling water business based in India. We spoke in early August 2022, and I was excited to talk to Ashish because his book, Drawing on Courage, reminded me how important having courage and taking a stand are in the creative process. Ashish was very easy to talk to, and we talked about many topics, including COVID and losing his mother to COVID, being inspired by the resilience of the world during COVID, growing up wanting to be a comic book designer, his experience at the D.school, learning to be brave and creating, the writing of his book, Drawing on Courage, using design thinking to deal with rejection, fear versus love as motivation, change as part of the journey of courage, using our gut to make decisions, the future of higher education, and the importance of beauty in decision-making. Ashish reminds us that the creative act can be scary, that facing the blank page or the blank whiteboard does not come easily to most, and that leap of faith is worth making, is in fact essential in every creative endeavor. This conversation is one of many weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, authors, and entrepreneurs who are working to change our world for the better. I just received a couple of new books from the Stanford D.school, and we're working on setting up those interviews as well. They include the books Creative Hustle, This is a Prototype, and You Need a Manifesto. Interesting titles. So if you want to hear these and the other episodes we've got for you, please follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Ashish Goel. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from Ashish Goel. Ashish, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Aran. It's great to be here.
Before we dive into courage and all these amazing topics, I'd like to get a sense of the person's day-to-day experience, especially with everything that's happening in the world today. And so I'd like to start by asking, what is it like to be you in the world today?
In the world today is Sunday. It's 8 p.m. Sundays are, right now I'm working with a technology startup in India called Blinkit, which delivers groceries in 10 minutes. So Sunday is recharging. Went to the bookstore and got some copies of my book today to send to a few friends. And then, well, COVID and everything is settled down, so life seems back to normal.
That's great. I mean, India was definitely hit hard with COVID. I think that everywhere in the world got hit, but there was definitely some tragedy happening probably around you. So what was your experience of COVID? And how do you tie it to courage, and how do you tie it to what's your book is about?
For me, it was really challenging, actually. In India, we, just like the rest of the world, we had those two waves. And the first wave was, of course, everything was locked down, and that was challenging. And then things had settled down, life has started getting back to normal. And the second wave hit India like few others. And I lost my mom to the second wave. And it happened so quickly. I caught it. And then 2 weeks later, she had it. And it was just 4 days. And the medical infrastructure in India was really stressed at that time. Yeah. So for me, it was it was a life-changing experience in something I didn't expect would come to pass. Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, we've had so my grandmother recently passed away, and she really wasn't ever better after she got COVID. And I think it was a very short time, but we can't point to COVID as a definite cause. She was hospitalized for COVID and then came back home and never recovered. And unfortunately, we all know a lot of people who lost loved ones, really horrendous disease. So is there anything that you learned from this process of going through this pandemic and everything that happened, anything that you're taking forward with you?
I think if I go back to the event of losing my mother, it's really about, you don't really know what's going to happen when, right? So we spend a lot of our time planning for the future, making sure that I have the resources and means to be able to do the future Ashish will value. And I'm sure a lot of people have that experience in different ways when the pandemic happened, from their movements being restricted to losing their jobs. And for me, that event was losing my mother. And it really felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. And now it's about figuring out what life looks like as without that rock being there in my life. And on the flip side, I think it's also taught me that how the world's pretty resilient. Yes, the pandemic happened, and there are people who have thrived, businesses that have survived and grown in the process. So there's also that learning that when something like this hits the world, people can emerge from it stronger.
Yeah. I've lost a couple of people in this time, and I think my approach, and this is pretty heavy right on the right at the start. But what I've learned is that I wasn't prepared. I thought I was prepared. I thought that I meditated enough, and that I thought about the transitory nature of life and everything you're supposed to do. But when it happens, it's actually so final in a way that doesn't compute. That's what I've learned. And I think it's a process, but it's making me a more rational decision maker in my life.
What felt final when you said it was really final? What felt final?
A good friend died last year, and I went from one vision of life where I had this friend with me and I could communicate with him and get his opinion on things, to another version where that was just not going to happen, and that was final. Like there's nobody to negotiate with the terms of.
I sometimes do fake. I'll turn on my voice recorder and do a fake phone call to my mother sometimes. And I hear something, my brain creates responses that feel like what she might have said.
Yeah.
It's now over a year, so I'm able to voice some of these things, which I don't think I would have been able to in 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's the same with me. I have these conversations sometimes. I don't know if you use WhatsApp, but I've used WhatsApp heavily with this friend. And so I just went in and then did an export of all of our WhatsApp conversations just so I can see what's in there. And there were so many great photos and videos from his life and messages. I had to put it aside. I didn't, it's there, it's saved. I don't know when I'll look at it again, but at some point I will.
I did that too. And my mother wasn't really from a generation that would type a lot. So most of the time she would contact me was via phone call. So our WhatsApp is a lot of, are you going to eat this evening? Or just such mundane things over and over. But I also found I had this great discovery, which speaks to the kind of person my mother was. So my brother runs his own business, which is like a contract manufacturing factory. And that had to be shut down during COVID. So my mother took a series of steps to get the factory opened. And in her notebook, she had kept a log of what she did, all that it took for the factory to be reopened. And she sent, for some reason, she had sent me a picture of that, of all of those steps, which was a nice reminder about, she never really took no for an answer. If she wanted to go after something, she went after it. And there was some, I was glad to see that I had sent her a few I love yous. And I was happy to see that.
That's important. It's important. So this actually brings us into the first question that I do usually ask. It gets us into the journey, which is, what's something you learned in childhood or early in life that still drives or guides you today, that's still active in your life today?
I think something that I used to do in childhood, which retroactively I realized was really fundamental to me, was that I was always a designer. I loved comic books and wanted to be a comic book artist. So I have some sketches of an old Indian comic book hero called Nagaraj, which is like a snake man. I used to do like mixed CDs, and then I would spend a lot of time sketching on the CD cover to get the typography of the artist just right. I once did my cupboard a certain way so that it was easier to get t-shirts out of that cupboard. But I didn't really name it as, or know it as, an act of design until much later in life, because I first trained as an engineer, then I started a company with a few friends. So it wasn't until I was 27, 28 that I understood that there was something called design. It operated in this way. And so when looking back at my childhood, I remember when I was sending in my transcript to Stanford to apply, the only courses I had done well in, they would have been courses that were right for a designer. And then all the other courses like biochemical engineering, which was my major, I hadn't done too well in. So that was also, retroactively, my transcript made sense to me. It's almost like I discovered a part of my childhood of who I was, but only looking backward.
Yeah. I've had a similar experience. I didn't know what I was, but someone told me the best way to find out what you should do with your life is think about where your brain goes to when you're in the shower, when, unguided. And my brain always goes to like creative problem solving. It's always like thinking about some problem from like different angles. Yeah, and then it wasn't until I really encountered design as a theory and design thinking that I realized, that's how my brain always works, right? This is, So you said you studied engineering, and then you started a company. What was the pivot point that made you decide to go study design?
Yeah, so I studied engineering, and then this is 2005. I really think of the digital product as there were two waves, especially in India. One is the dot-com boom, which is the late 90s. And the other was after the smartphone revolution hit, which is post-2008. So we started a company right in the middle in 2005. It was called itasveer.com. And we were going to get people to upload their photos online and then print them on a variety of media. I think the closest is a Cafe Press or a Zazzle that I don't think are as popular anymore in the US. So that was the company. And there were four of us. We were all college friends. And when we were starting, we all picked a thing that somebody would do. So one guy would handle the business. One guy would handle the programming. And I said, okay, I can do design because I used to do all the posters for college events and I like dabbling in Photoshop. But I always thought that you can hire someone to do that who was a professional designer, and then I'm gonna stop doing it. But that never happened. I kept we were largely a website, so I kept doing web design. And two things happened. One, I really enjoyed it. I just really enjoyed the act of putting those pixels together and get people through a series of screens or steps to get them to achieve something. And the other thing I realized was that, design is not just such this narrow field, especially when, like you said, design thinking, when I discovered design thinking, I realized that design can be much broader and you can apply those set of skills to a business, to any kind of a context, and then come out on the other side with something novel and interesting as a response to that prompt. So that got me really excited about studying design. A lot of people with my background would typically go to an MBA. So when we sold our company 5 years later, I had a few choices. I could have stayed in that world, started another company, worked with another tech company or a startup, or I could go study design thinking, which is what I was really excited to do. And that's how I found my way to the world of design and choosing to study it more formally at Stanford.
We've spoken to a few people from the D.school at Stanford, and it sounds like a really magical place. What was your experience there?
It was life-changing. I had so many moments, so many experiences, both ones where I felt like, what the hell am I doing? And also they were really uplifting, both of which were really ground for my growth there. There are a few that I can think of. We had a class called form giving, which is where we had to make a lamp. The prompt was make an illuminating object, but you had to do everything. You had to come up with a concept, you had to come up with a brand, you had to actually work in the machine shop and construct the thing. And so far I had only done digital design and web design. And the cool thing with web design is that you have a lot of references. When I was doing the website or different features for iTheSphere, I could have several tabs open and then take references, ideas from different things. And I had some answer that I could then code and ship. And how do you do a completely novel and unique illuminating object? And to do that, I had to dig into stuff that I loved in childhood: comics, video games, Super Mario. And I remember sitting in the machine shop at one point in time, watching that video of Ira Glass talking about taste, the lovely bit that he has about how you have great taste, but you don't...
Your taste is better than your ability to execute
yes.
it. Yeah.
Yes. And I was crying. And the assignment was due the day after tomorrow. But in the end, I came through. And what my realization was, I did not know that I had the ability to create something like that. I surprised myself in the act of creating not just then that lamp, but other things that I came up with. So that was really magical. The other thing that was really magical is no matter how much design thinking now is a buzzword or even derided a little bit, there really are these tools that you can use to think better. And when I had left the D.school to come back to work in India, I could notice myself using those tools. So diverging and then converging. And I could see in the room which mode a person was in, which I couldn't before. Or we talk about the why, how ladder. You're going from more abstract when you go why, and then you get more concrete when you ask how.
So you wrote this beautiful book, Drawing on Courage. I have it right behind me. I don't know if you can see it, but it's just beautiful. And
thank you.
The illustrations are also just incredible. So some parts are like a comic book, and it's just a beautiful book. I recommend the actual book and not the digital, even though I'm sure that's beautiful too. But so
thanks, Iran.
Why write a book about courage?
Yeah. So the illustrations, since you mentioned the illustrations, are done by Ruby Elliott. I'm so glad I got to work with her. And she has one of the most humorous and heartwarming Instagram pages, which I recommend everyone to follow. It's Ruby ETC on Instagram. And she took my script and doodles, she brought them to life. I love how much expression she's packed into those stick figures. So why courage? So it actually relates really strongly back to my time at the D.school. I was interviewing a friend who also went to the D school about his moments of courage. And he used a great phrase for the D school. He said, D school is an encouraging environment, which it really is, because we're asking people to take a creative risk. And that's scary. But the D school does a really good job of, the classrooms don't look like regular classrooms. All the educators model those behaviors that would be very disapproved of in a regular classroom. So it's possible for you to be there and take a risk, to act with courage. But what happens when you leave that world and go back to your own environment? I remember doing a tour of the D school. We do these tours of the D school multiple days a week. And then somebody asked me, okay, this is great, Ashish, but how do I take this back to where I work? And I remember telling him it's monkey see, monkey do, because you see so many people doing those behaviors here. Other people find it easier to do it. But when I had left the D school and I moved back to India, so I joined Zomato, which is an Indian technology startup. And I was there for 2 years, and I felt I had collected all the skills that I needed to now make a difference. But this was a different environment. And I felt there were a lot of times that even though I had a skill, I had a tool, I had an answer, it wasn't always easy to... It was a given that is what would happen, right? A lot of the challenges came down to how you work with different people. A lot of challenges came out to whether or not you could stand up for your idea in a meeting when the popular opinion is otherwise. When the school decided they were doing this series of books, and I wondered what is something that was important for me to have left the encouraging environment of the D school, come back to my home country, to a place that I know well, to bring these ideas and tools to life, is courage. I see courage as this gap where you've done all the preparation, you have the skills and knowledge, but unless you apply it, and there are also scenarios where you're ill-prepared, you feel like, oh, I don't know enough, you still have to go ahead and act. And I think that takes courage.
Yeah. So I think there's something that designers call on when they approach a new problem that has a lot of uncertainty. And some people call it faith, and some people call it belief in the possibility, and some people call it courage. What's the connection between design and courage? Why write a book about courage as part of the design school series?
Well, there are two ways of thinking about it, right? One is courageous design, where you're making an interface or an object or an environment, and that's different from what's given. So that's courageous. In this book, I'm not talking about courageous design. Instead, what I'm more interested in is what I call couraging with design. So you take those tools of design or design thinking, but you apply it back to your everyday. You apply it back to a difficult conversations you're supposed to have with a friend or colleague. You apply it back to, if you're an entrepreneur, picking up that phone and making that end sales call where you might get rejected. It's about taking those tools of design to go up on stage if you have to give a speech. So yes, design needs courage. And I think within the sort of sphere of what you're creating, you can think outside the box, you can be innovative. And yes, all of that is an act of courage. But I was really interested in all the other stuff that's around it that someone, even who's not a designer, has to navigate, where design might help, which is also the thesis of the D school, right? They don't want people to come to the D school and then become designers. They want lawyers, business students, doctors, journalists to come to the D school, learn the tools of design, and then go back and apply it to their own context.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So you have a lot of practical tips in the book about how to deal with fear. And so maybe let's take just one example. So, a lot of people are afraid of rejection.
Yes.
Are afraid of risking rejection. What are some tools that come from the world of design that can help us face rejection?
One of the tools of design is iteration. So you put something out in the world, you learn why it doesn't work, and then you do it again. And what the world of design, and especially the world of design thinking, recommends is two things. One, don't be too attached to what you've put out in the world, A. And B, don't spend too much time building it. Do the least required for you to learn something, right? So this is what they call a prototype. So one story that I remember from my time as a student was I was doing a behavior design class with BJ Fogg. And there was a student, and BJ had given us all an assignment about some behavior that you had to design in your own life. One of my classmates, he made sure that he would get rejected at least once each day. And he tried like the randomest things. He went to a party that he was not invited to and said, hey, can I join this party? And they said, sure. So the funny parts about his rejection game, as he called it, which I found comes from a Canadian entrepreneur who calls it rejection therapy, but he would keep doing it till he would get at least one no each day. But also what was great is there are all these moments that he didn't hear a no. And so in that manner, he actually not just gained the ability to be rejected and recover from it, but also all these moments which he would have signed himself out of, but because he asked, he got that. And I also, in my book, I call this like taking a tiny risk. And one of my favorite stories from recent time, from after the book came out, there's a colleague of mine who I thought was really quiet, and I did not know what was up with him. And then one fine day, he comes up to me and says, hi. And that's it. He doesn't say anything else. And he said, I have nothing else besides that hi. Because he said, in your book, you say if you want to take a tiny risk, just say hi to a stranger. So I'm doing that. And then we had an hour-long conversation about how he chose to become a designer, what's his backstory. But it was also so heartening for me to have a real life review, so to speak, of someone taking a tiny risk and then it turning out great.
Yeah, that's great. I heard a similar exercise where wherever you go, whatever you buy, you ask for a 10% discount, no matter what.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to try that. I'm going to use that.
And so you hear a lot of no's, but occasionally you get a 10% discount, and that builds that muscle. That is very scary to me, to ask for a 10% discount.
Really? Tell me, why is that scary?
I don't know. Like, it's image related. It's like, I don't want to be the type of person that asks for the 10% discount. I don't want to be liked. It's really interesting, and it's something that is supposed to be very helpful with sales or with building a business, because you have that muscle of being able to take rejection.
But I think here's another thing that I think we just tried right now, which comes from the world of design, is really powerful, is reflection. Because at a first look, it could be just the fear of rejection, but as you thought about it, there's so much caught up in it, right? There is about how you see yourself, your identity, how others might see you. I think when you do these things and then you reflect, okay, what happened there? You can actually uncover all the ways in which your psyche or your fear tries to thwart your attempts, which goes beyond just that one event of rejection.
For sure. That's really interesting. So what's the connection between courage and values?
So when I was figuring out what's a framework that people can use when they're struggling with doing something challenging. I was reading up some of the stuff that you've written, and you, in one of your introduction to design sprints, you talk about the fear barrier, and you say how people subconsciously avoid tasks and projects that produce bad news. It's a great way of framing it. So when people are avoiding things that potentially are good for them or something that they'll want, but there is also a very high likelihood of bad news, those are the kind of scenarios in life that need courage. And I've broken up into this journey of 4 stops. So the first stop is fear, because it starts with the feeling that, oh, there's bad news ahead, I shouldn't proceed. The second stop is values. That's the thing that's driving you forward. The third stop is action, what you do finally in that situation. And the fourth stop is change. So that's the consequences or the bad news or potentially the good news that might come your way after you take that action. So values to me is fundamental because a lot of acts of courage are voluntary. There's no one really pushing you to do it. It's really up to you whether you do it or not do it. So what's the thing that's pushing you forward? So either it's a value that is really important to you. For example, if you're someone who really cares about sustainability as a value, and you're in an organization that produces consumer goods, how do you marry those two things? So you have to be an agent of change in that organization because this is something that matters to you, and then do things or take on projects or have conversations that might change the way that organization does things. Or let's say something that you value is freedom. And if you're a creator or a freelancer or an entrepreneur, you might have to do things like, for example, you might have to put your work out there. You might have to, for all the world to see and then comment on or diss or so on and so forth. Yeah. But that is necessary for you to create a business or create an audience or whatever it might be that you need to do for you to have the freedom, the value, something that drives you. I think of fear and values as those two opposing forces that are playing on you. One is pushing you forward to act with courage, and the other is pulling you back that there's bad news ahead.
I heard this before with contrasting fear and love, and really values are the things that you love. Right? It's a nice symmetry, and it also explains really beautifully why we need courage. We need courage for the things we value and love.
Yes.
And you also talk about change as a component in that formula. So what's the role of change in courage, or why do we have to think about change when we think about courage?
I think that fourth stop is really where the fear comes from, right? The phrase that you use in your essay, bad news. You're doing a project, you're taking an action that might produce bad news. So it's the anticipation of what will happen after you do something that creates fear. I think a lot of conversations about courage skip that part, right? We talk about fear, we talk about taking action, we talk about doing it for a worthy cause or something that you value. But really, what you're doing everything for is what happens after. So I call that change because you don't know what the texture of what that change is going to be. Is that going to be great? That, hey, I got a 10% discount. Or is it going to be shame where maybe you were with a friend and you asked for a discount and then you're forever seen as a cheapskate? Or it's indeterminate. So they can go in 3 ways. It can go how you hoped it to go, you failed, or the third one, which I think is really hard, which you don't know if it went well or it didn't go well. I think change is where both the hesitation comes from, why you need courage at all. Because if it was easy, if you could anticipate what was going to happen, then it won't take courage. And it's also what you're really trying to do. You know, you're trying to get your company to or organization to adopt different ways of doing things, or you want a change in your own life. So that's how the fourth stop, change, connects to the theme of courage.
Nice. Is there a change you'd like to see in the world? If everybody read this book, how would we live differently? What would the world look like? What's the change you're hoping to see?
A friend of mine asked me some time ago, what is something that you know or you believe that a lot of other people don't believe? And I told her, beauty drives everything.
Hmm.
And I think beauty is not always rational. So in the book, I've spoken about how there are these two schools of going about the world. One is extremely rational, data-driven, almost entirely going by what does the current evidence say, and we should act based on that.
Hmm.
And I think there is a whole other set of actions or choices you can make that are driven by your gut, that are driven by things that are emotional, that you can't make sense of them through logic. But I really think those actions can really open new avenues and doors that you didn't know they could open. Which is also, I mean, fundamentally, I mean, if you were to think about scenarios where you need courage, all rational analysis will imply that you should not do this, but you do them anyway.
Mm.
So one change I would like to see in the world is people to trust their hearts more and bring impact into the world through beauty.
What does beauty mean to you in this context?
Yeah, I said that without reflecting on that enough. I think beauty means many things. I think beauty means that's, if anything, that's the one thing that I think designers do that is different from other kinds of problem solving, where they bring art into an object, whether it's a chair or a book or an interface, where it's also about how are you making people feel when they are navigating the world, when they're using an object, and not just what you help them do, but how you make them feel. I think that comes down to beauty.
Yeah. So I recently interviewed Irene Au, who was the head of design at Google and Yahoo and a whole bunch of other companies. Very interesting conversation. And she said, design is like music. We judge music by how it makes us feel. And does it make me feel understood? Does it tap into what I'm feeling? And design is the same way. Products need to make us feel understood and seen. And that could be called beauty. The beauty of a music or beauty is when we connect with it emotionally.
Yeah.
So you're doing this project with Stanford around the future of learning. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that? Is there anything you can share?
Absolutely. I actually should reach back to Sarah and Scott, who are the executive director and the creative director at the D.school, about what is happening with the project now. But this is a project that I did while I was there from 2013 to 2014. So it's a few years ago. We called it Stanford 2025. And the idea was, what does the future of living and learning in a place on campus look like on any university? It was a 2-year-long project. We ran classes with that theme. We did a lot of ethnographic work and a lot of design work. And what we did at the end is we set up like a museum, but the museum was in the year 2100 because we wanted people to look back on what had happened so that all these different stakeholders from the university could go back with a provocation, not necessarily an answer. And then we had 4 themes. One was called the Open Loop University. One was called Purpose Learning, and so on. So, for example, the Open Loop University was about what happens if college was not 4 years? What would the accreditation system look like if college was not 4 years? How would people step in and out, take a loop out, take a loop in if the college was
that would be amazing.
Not 4 years? And similarly, for purpose learning, the idea was people would not choose a major, but they would choose a mission. So there was a phone call from the dean on what someone's mission was. So you could pick up the phone in this museum and get a phone call about your mission. So the idea was taking all of these assumptions or all of these things that we know are a given about a college experience, and based on what we had learned through the research that we had done with students, how could we challenge these assumptions, but then really help people feel what would it be like if this thing did not exist in the format that it does. And we didn't want to produce a presentation or a report, but an experience people could embed themselves in. And I think from that, many things have come up, which, like I said, I haven't stayed in the loop on what became of the project after we did this Museum of the Future. But all of those themes have found a home in different schools, different institutes, different initiatives that people have taken an idea from purpose learning or open loop and then applied that to how they are running their educational experiences.
I would love to find out what happened with the open loop, because this is something I've been dreaming about. I recently did a master's degree in religious studies. My focus was on Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, but the saddest thing was when it was over and I couldn't take any more classes because I did all the classes. And now I had to work in a vacuum in the library and write my thesis, but there were no more classes. And I was like, why? Classes are happening, don't they? Like, why can't I go to more classes? And so I would love to see that actually embraced by more universities. I would pay for it. It's a wonderful and enriching thing to you can add that to your lifestyle and it doesn't ever have to end.
Yes. And here again, right, here's an idea that I think everyone who came across that idea got excited about like, yes, I would love that. But then how do you make that happen when you're in a university system that's operated in a certain way? So someone has to act with courage and try something first.
So I have one final question for you today. So in his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he says a lecture is this modern day invention. It's very dry, factual, and then you leave the decision to the person who listens, and there's no real emotion in it. And a sermon is an urgent plea to change someone's life. We're kind of trying to grab them by the collar and tell them this is important. And he longs for the days of sermons. So my question to you is, if you could give a short sermon, what would it be about?
Oh, that is an excellent question, Iran. I think we touched on that topic earlier in our conversation. And I'm glad you're asking me that, because it'll also, to give it in the form of a sermon instead of giving it in the form of a lecture, would also force me to dig deep and investigate, which is, we do things not because of how we think, because of how we feel. Emotion is everything. And what draws us to things is also not because of the utility to us, but because of how they make us feel. So beauty drives everything. So I would create a sermon on the role of emotion in our lives and the role of beauty in our lives. Also, by the way, this thing matters, but make it a sermon that this is the only thing that matters. That would be something I might write a sermon about. And that's a great project you've given me to work on after this podcast.
Next book, maybe.
One of the outlines, I don't know if you do that, but I do have outlines of books that I might write. And when I was studying design and design thinking, one of the outlines that I have of a book that I might write was the role of emotion throughout the design thinking process. Like, how does it feel to interview someone? The struggles it feels to come up with an insight or an aha. How does it feel to put something out in the world? So I'm going to look that up after our conversation.
Thank you, Ashish. I appreciate your time today. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Ran.
Remake is produced by myself and Regina Rothstein. Research and editing by Louis Brady. And audio engineering by Greg Cocoveos. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also just makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We're a global strategic design sprint agency aimed at improving outcomes through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone, and see you next week on Remake.